having been with many of you for the last 4.5 years since this crazy project came up, you know, we've been talking about, at the end of the day, the legal aspects are going to be really important, and hopefully that's one way of potentially stopping this proposal. So let me start with a case that SELC, Southern Environmental Law Center, actually lost. Okay, always start with the worst news first, right? So in this case, it's called Appalachian Voices versus the State Water Control Board. And the case was filed back in January of 2018 in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And one of the things that we've talked about previously, I don't know, how many of you listened to me in September when I did this before? Okay, so a few of you. So you understand why most of these cases are in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, or one case is now in the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, and we'll talk about that. And the reason for that is the Natural Gas Act. The Natural Gas Act requires that if you're going to sue FERC, or if you're going to question them in court, then you have to go to a circuit court. The circuit court that Virginia sits in is the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. However, you can also go to the District of Columbia Circuit Court, because any lawsuit against a federal agency always can be brought in the District of Columbia. Okay, so that's kind of some procedural background. So this case is a case that dealt with the Clean Water Act, and it's Section 401. Section 401 is a part of the Clean Water Act. It requires that basically the state of Virginia grant a permit. And SELC made the argument that that permit that was granted by the Water Control Board was arbitrary and capricious, didn't take all the facts into consideration. Long story short, the court upheld the permit. The decision was handed down in January of 2019. The reason I think that's important and is also kind of relevant to what's going on literally today is, as many of you know, the President has just signed 2 executive orders. One executive order deals with liquid natural gas going over through international boundaries. The other one has to do with Section 401. And it basically is going to make it more difficult for states to deny FERC approved programs and pipelines from going through various states. Like, for example, New York State recently denied the 401 permit on a pipeline, and therefore it was stopped. This executive order is aimed at that, but it's not really going to impact the ACP because they've already got the 401 permit. You know, the Clean Water Board has already signed it, so they're all good to go. So I wanted to start with that one because, you know, that's just the way it is, and it also ties into the executive orders. And so I thought, well, maybe some of you would be interested in knowing, how do those executive orders impact the ACP? That's how they impact the ACP. They don't. All right, the next one that I want to talk about is Sierra Club versus the Department of Interior. Again, this case was brought in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And in this case, the court threw out the National Park Service permit, which allowed Dominion to drill under the parkway and under the Appalachian Trail. The decision was handed down back in August, and the court ruled that the Park Service had been arbitrary and capricious in its decision to grant that permit. The current status of that particular case is that the Park Service is working on a new permit. The old permit was basically voluntarily remanded back to the Park Service, and so the Park Service now has to come up with potentially a better rationale, a more logical rationale, for granting that permit. Part of the problem that they have, I believe, is that the basis of those permits for the Park Service and for the Forest Service and for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, all of those come from the environmental impact statement that was written by Dominion that you've all looked at, great big thick document, and in my view and in SELC's view, that document is very poorly written and probably does not stand up to judicial scrutiny. We're going to find out about that in another case that we're going to talk about. So anyway, Sierra Club versus Department of Interior, that's the National Park Service. And that particular permit is back at the National Park Service. It's being reconsidered. The next one that I want to talk about is the Cow Pasture River Preservation Association versus U.S. Forest Service. And this is a really, really important case. It was argued in the Fourth Circuit again back in September 28th. And the issue was whether or not the Forest Service issued a permit to cross the Monongahela and George Washington National Forest, and whether or not that issuance of the permit was arbitrary and capricious. Again, this case was won by SELC at the Fourth Circuit. The permit was vacated by the court, meaning the court said, you don't have the permit anymore, stop, cease and desist, you can't go forward because you don't have a permit. That was denied on February 20th of 2019. And as some of you are probably aware, Dominion is now considering asking the Supreme Court of the United States for something known as certiorari. Don't ask me to spell it, but certiorari is a way that the Supreme Court of the United States allows an appeal. Keep in mind that about 1% of all cases that are requested to be appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States are actually appealed. The Supreme Court has total discretion on whether or not it wants to take this case and hear it, or whether it wants to say, no, we're not going to question what the Fourth Circuit has done and said. Obviously, if the Supreme Court takes the case, there's going to be an oral argument. Dominion has until May 28th. They basically have 90 days from the day that the Fourth Circuit actually ruled. And one other little factoid there. When you go to the Fourth Circuit, the original panel is a 3-judge panel of judges. So you go and you make your oral argument, and those 3 people have read all the briefs on both sides, and that's really who you're talking with. That 3-judge panel is the panel that votes initially. In this Cow Pasture River case, Dominion went back to the Fourth Circuit and they said, we would like you to rehear the case, and we'd like to have you do that, and this is another legalese term, sitting en banc, E-N-B-A-N-C, en banc, which means that all 12 judges of the circuit would sit and listen to this case and rehear it. The Fourth Circuit says, no, we're not going to do that. There's no need for us to do that. So from the date of that opinion, Dominion has 90 days to request certiorari. And so that means May 28th. So mark that on your calendars, because either the Supreme Court's going to take that case on May 28th or it will not. And if it does not, then the Fourth Circuit opinion stands. It is good law, and that means that the Forest Service permit has been vacated and they have to go back and totally redo it. This is the case, by the way, in which some of all these cases are cases that are done on the administrative record. There's no witness that comes up and testifies and goes through that whole process that most of us are familiar with. If you watch, TV shows that have courtroom drama, there's always a jury and there's, all that. That's not the way this is at all. This is totally a paperwork exercise. So there is something that we call the administrative record, and in this case, that administrative record showed that the Forest Service admitted that they were given an EIS that had faulty water pollution and faulty erosion data in it. So that's really very, very helpful. And it leads us to the next case that I want to talk about, which is, bear with me here, Appalachian Voices versus FERC. Appalachian Voices versus FERC. This case was a case that was originally brought by SELC in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. However, Dominion brought a case of its own in the District of Columbia Circuit Court. And because of a procedural boo-boo, this case is now being heard in the District of Columbia Circuit Court. So the court basically combined the pleadings that were submitted in the Fourth Circuit to the others, and there's now one case that's in the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia. That this case is the first opportunity that a court will have to actually look at and consider whether or not the environmental impact statement that was prepared by Dominion is faulty. Does it meet some of the basic tests of courts that have been looking at NEPA for, 50 years ago NEPA was passed. 1969, Richard Nixon signed it, and this is the law that basically says that whenever there's a major federal action significantly affecting or impacting the quality of the human environment, that you have to do an environmental impact statement. And of course, Dominion did that. And SELC is arguing that FERC relied on granting the overall permit incorrectly because the document that it is based on, i.e. the EIS, is improperly written. It does not take what we call a hard look, that's in quotes, hard look, that's what the law requires, of the environmental impacts. NEPA is the only federal statute that requires environmental justice be considered and discussed in the environmental impact statement. Now, as most of you are aware, there's a huge environmental justice issue in Buckingham County with this proposed pipeline and the route that is being proposed. That has, in our opinion, not been adequately considered and addressed, and it'll be the first time that that issue really has had a chance to be heard by a court of law. So I think I'm pretty excited about that. The other major issue is one that several of us have been working on for years and years, and that's called alternatives. NEPA requires that in the environmental impact statement, the proponent looks at, discusses, considers all reasonable alternatives to the proposed action and discusses the environmental impacts associated with each and every one of those. Well, that clearly was not done. And so again, we think that there is a very good chance that the District of Columbia Circuit Court will take a hard look of its own and hopefully will rule in our favor. Now, the opening brief in this case was just filed. April 5th was the opening brief. Oral arguments are likely in September or October of this year, 2019. And I'm guessing that an opinion from the District of Columbia Court is probably going to happen in December, maybe January. Depends on how hard they work and, you know, how difficult the issues are for them in terms of how long it takes them. Oh, I will say this. This is the same court. The District of Columbia Circuit Court is the same court that threw out a similar case for the MVP. So when I was talking to SELC yesterday and trying to get caught up on what was going on with all these different cases, the first question that came to my mind was, well, is there a distinction between the MVP case and the ACP case? And they feel very, very strongly that there is a huge distinction, that the EIS is egregiously inadequate in the case of ACP, and they just felt as though they have a much better chance of winning their arguments than the MVP did. Strategically, I might say that the Fourth Circuit has been very good to the ACP. They have ruled, with one exception, in the favor of SELC and basically against Dominion on all counts. So one might hope that the case that I'm just referring to would be in the Fourth Circuit. But as I indicated, it's not going to be. It's in the District of Columbia Circuit. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that the District of Columbia Circuit Court is a very conservative court in terms of the Natural Gas Act. They are going to interpret the National Gas Act very narrowly, and they're going to give it a lot of credence. However, the District of Columbia Circuit Court is also the first court to ever hear a NEPA case 50 years ago, and it has a huge amount of precedent in NEPA and is a very liberal court when it comes to interpreting NEPA. If they find that FERC relied on an environmental impact statement that is inadequate, it means that they have to go back and redo the whole environmental impact statement. What they will do is they will issue what's known as a supplemental environmental impact statement. But what that means is you go back through the process of public hearings, public comment, and you have to rewrite the document. My experience is, and I've done a lot of these over the last 45 years, it will take at least 2 years to go through that process. So if we can win in January, the likelihood of this program being delayed for at least 2 more years is very high. Yes, ma'am?
What's the comfort to the landowners whose land is being cut?
Well, here's my answer to them. I think that the Forest Service and the National Park Service are not likely to try to move forward with their permits, which would allow construction prior to the District of Columbia opinion.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. And yet Dominion's been saying to every piece of press that will listen that they're planning on getting started again third quarter.
Right, I understand.
Okay.
SELC is all ready for that.
Great news. I'm happy to hear this.
Yes, yes ma'am.
So this morning, the president said he's willing to issue emergency executive orders to jumpstart these projects.
Yes, that's what I was just referring to.
I'm sorry. And what?
Okay, so the emergency executive orders,
Right.
one of them deals with LNG going across international borders. So that's not relevant to us at all. The other one has to do with states issuing certification under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act.
I'm sorry.
Okay?
Just kind of.
And so they're very limited in scope, and they'll impact New York State, where they have a governor that actually believes in the environment.
Right.
Unlike perhaps somebody that we know.
So.
And so that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Officially issue a stop work order
I think that construction has stopped primarily for the lack of those two permits for the for the going over the Appalachian Trail or the Parkway. And I will say this to you all. The biggest threat right now is that Congress is going to pass a law, add it to an omnibus bill or something. They've just tried it. It failed. But if they pass a law that exempts this pipeline from having to worry about fish and wildlife, et cetera, and gives them authority to go over or under the A Trail and the Parkway, then that's not a good thing. So, I mean, it really behooves all of you, all of us, to make sure that all of our congressional and Senate representatives understand how important it is for them to be alert and to do whatever it takes for them to stop that from happening, stop the legislation from happening that would grant them access to going under the A Trail or the Parkway. Okay? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
If they are applied, do they have any impact on the permit for the
No. Two distinct.
even though they're crossing?
Yeah, no.
And
Right. Nope. I mean, I'm sorry to say that the MVP is the MVP and the ACP is the ACP, and the facts are different, and the EIS is different, and so everything is different, and so they're going to stand or fall individually, not together.
it's not even in the sense of establishing mutual precedent.
Well, of course, there's always, I mean, if the ACP is establishing really good precedent, then the MVP can utilize that precedent for their own, legal purpose. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
Has anybody challenged the MVP call for the Appalachian?
I don't know the answer. I truly don't know the answer. The MVP is really being legally handled, if you will, by AppleMad out of West Virginia. And I really haven't chatted with those folks. Before I do this again, I will. Okay, moving on.
Can I clarify one thing, Rick? That
Yes.
You said? I just want to be really clear. Are you saying that you don't believe that the ACP will have the right to cut trees on non-Forest Service land, private landowner land, for which they have easements or for which they will apply for quick take this September because of the Forest Service ruling? I was under the impression that they may not get through the Forest Service land because they won't approve that until that gets resolved.
Right.
But in the meantime, everywhere they've got an easement and or they've got the opportunity for quick take, they're likely to begin tree cutting.
It's possible.
Okay.
Certainly possible, yeah. I mean, because
Yeah.
if they've got the easement and, they're not stopped for any other reason, then they can, obviously. Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
I asked Greg that question, and he said that they would be, if they started any other place, even the place when the petrol station was
Yep.
started up.
Yep.
He said they will bring it right before the good force to try to stop it.
Right. Like I said, I think SCLC is anticipating that's going to happen, and they're going to do whatever they can to stop it. Sir.
Yeah, I wanted to say for the Mountain Valley Pipeline that it also does have in the Federal Circuit Court in West Virginia, there's a statement which kind of entertaining to read that quotes the Lower Acts that revoked the permit to the forest. It hasn't been appealed to the Supreme Court, so it was just in the Fourth Circuit, but not higher than that.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So we've been hearing things about them saying, okay, well, we're not going to do the northern part of the route right now, but we're going to get started in Buckingham, and we're going to go ahead and plow on south because
that area isn't affected by these national forest permits that are on hold, and we don't have those endangered species down there.
Yep,
I've also heard that there are things of, that's segmenting a project.
right.
And that with the project that you asked for was this project that brings from Marcellus Shale all the way down to North Carolina. If you start in Buckingham and get your gas out of Transco and send it to North Carolina, that's a different project. So, which I think would argue towards, and I'm hoping that we're going to hear more about that argues that they don't really need this because they can get that fixed.
Right.
But I guess I would love to hear from the legal perspective, what is true or not true about that? What do we know that's true or not true? Can they split the project like that? Is SDLC about to get all over them? Like,
Yeah, I think they are because, as you point out, when FERC issues, their permit, let's call it a permit, to go forward, what they're looking at is the entire project. And segmentation is clearly an issue. And also, changing the nature of that project goes directly away from what FERC allowed. And so I think SCLC is going to have a pretty good legal argument that, that the court needs to stop them from doing that until they can get this whole thing resolved. Ma'am.
Again, as I'm a representative of SNC, so I asked a lot of questions, and
Yeah.
that was the question. Because here's the issue. They won't call it segmentation. They'll call it phase one. And they'll say, phase one can begin in October, after notification, and then keep on going south. And we've already built the North Hampton registration, and we've already bought the green. So that's a legitimate thing. Let's just go ahead and do that. Under the guise of it being phase one, in hopes that if the whole thing gets stopped, they'll already have it in the ground, and they'll still get a lot. So when I raised that question, Greg said, you're absolutely right, wait, there isn't. When does it tip to say, now you're doing a different pipeline, because you're going to give up the rest of the counties and the rest of the routes?
Right.
So we just only,
The letter that sent to her talked about exactly like that. We're still talking about the entire project, and for administrative advantage, that the allowing footprint down the same kind of perfect. Is can we do this part now and be the right place? In fact, there is precedent that several recent pipelines have been built in phases. Any argument on both sides.
Right. Which is why people go to court.
Every now and again, you hear this argument of the possibility of Dominion finding a place to cross the Appalachian Trail, private land. What would you care to weigh in on that, and how is that really an option that would get them out from under these guns?
Most certainly you and I have talked about that for years.
Can you repeat Jim's
Yeah, I'm
question
sorry,
so
sure.
everybody-
The point that Jim's making is that there may be some locations coming across the Parkway and the Appalachian Trail that's actually private property that does not belong to the Park Service or the Forest Service. And if that's the case, and Dominion decides they want to change the location of their pipeline to make this whole thing work, can they do that? Can they use eminent domain, for example, to take that property? I would think the answer is probably yes. They probably can. But again, I think I still think you may have to go back to Congress to get authority to go across the Appalachian Trail. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's the trail. Sir.
If they had to make a substantial change to the land,
Yes.
wouldn't they need another?
They would have to do a supplemental environmental impact statement, yes. And that, you're talking 6 to 9 months or something like that. So let me...
It cost them a lot more too.
Yes, well, yeah. Cost does not seem to be an issue, does it? So anyway, there's one other case that I want to talk about, and that's Defenders of Wildlife versus the Department of Interior. I need to talk about it before my paper gets so wet I can't see what it says. No, I'm good. That was filed in May of last year, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service case, Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They go together. And this is the Endangered Species Act part of the litigation. And in this case, the court nullified the incidental take permit. In other words, U.S. Fish and Wildlife had granted an incidental take permit that if an endangered species is incidentally taken as we're building this pipeline through the middle of their habitat, then you got a permit. Well, U.S. Fish and Wildlife said no. The court said no, Fish and Wildlife, you did not take into consideration properly the requirements of the Endangered Species Act. And so, for at least 100 miles of the proposed pipeline, there are 4 different kinds of endangered species. And there are no permits now for those endangered species. So once again, they've got to go back to ground zero, and U.S. Fish has got to redo that whole permit process, all of which will take significant amounts of time. The other issue that is kind of an interesting issue is 404, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, administered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In this case, I believe that the district that is managing the 404 permit for the ACP is the Huntington, West Virginia District of the Corps of Engineers. And those folks had issued what we call a national permit. They had a national permit that looked at, instead of looking at every crossing, and I think there are like 1,000 stream crossings that they're proposing for the ACP, instead of looking at each one and getting a separate permit for each crossing, what they're trying to do is use a national permit which will allow them to cross them all. The Corps of Engineers has withdrawn the national permit, which is really cool. I mean, I've been practicing law for 45 years and I've never seen that happen before. So it's really, really cool that they've done that. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that they're not going to reissue it, but again, it's something that's time consuming, and right now they don't have that permit, so they can't be out there crossing streams without that permit. And that's true whether it's on private property or federal property or anybody else's property. You just can't cross streams without having that Corps of Engineers 404 permit. Okay, a new case that was filed in the Fourth Circuit is the Virginia Air Pollution Control Board case. Southern Environmental Law Center has filed a lawsuit against the Air Pollution Control Board in Virginia for acting arbitrarily and capriciously in the granting of the air pollution control permit that you're all aware of, that you all went and listened to that fiasco. And so there are basically 2 arguments. One is that the Clean Air Act was not complied with, especially as it relates to NOx emissions. NOx is nitrogen oxide, so nitrogen oxide issues are huge. There is interestingly enough, there is an environmental justice issue. Again, where is that compressor station going to be? Buckingham, right? In the middle of a primarily black community. Now, I said to you earlier that there's only one federal law that has an environmental justice component. That's NEPA. However, SELC has come up with a state statute that requires consideration of environmental justice issues in the new siting of new facilities. So it's going to be a novel argument. Do I think it's going to win or be a strong argument? I don't know. I would give it 50-50 probably. I think that SELC would give it 50-50 also. But I wanted to at least let you know that SELC has recently filed that, and that's another one that we should all be kind of watching and listening to. And then the final case that I'm going to talk about, I'm almost on time. The final case that I'm going to talk about is the ACP versus Nelson County. This case was argued on Monday in federal district court in the Western District of Virginia in front of the Honorable Judge Moon in Charlottesville, Virginia. And several of you all and I were there together listening to this interesting discussion. And the case is titled ACP versus Nelson County because Dominion is suing Nelson County over the fact that Nelson County denied the variance for their floodplain management program. So Nelson County did great stuff, and Nelson County basically is relying on FEMA and the floodplain insurance program, the floodplain insurance law. And so Dominion is suing Nelson County saying, hey, you can't do that. They're basically arguing, I believe, that the Nelson County law is preempted by the Natural Gas Act. Let me just see if I can find my place here where I'm in my wet document. The other issue is one of preemption. And so the Nelson County attorney was arguing that the Nelson County ordinance, which denied the permit variance, is based upon a federal law administered by FEMA, and that's the Flood Insurance Act, basically, for want of a better term, and that you cannot have a federal law be preempted by another federal law. In other words, one agency can't win out over another federal agency. That's the argument. The Natural Gas Act, however, seems to have a provision in it that says, A, the Natural Gas Act preempts all state and federal laws. No, I'm sorry, it says it preempts all state and local laws, all state and local ordinances. I'm sorry, that's what it said. And it preempts all federal statutes with the exception of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Coastal Zone Management Act. And Dominion really pounded on that during this argument. And so what will happen? Well, the judge has taken this case under advisement. The judge will probably, in my view, issue an opinion, a written opinion, in about 6 weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks at the most, maybe 8 weeks. But in the next month and a half or two, we'll hear about what the judge is ruling here. If Nelson County loses, it has a chance to appeal that case to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. If Dominion loses, they can appeal the case to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Or they may decide not to, and they may go back into the district court where the case will be heard on the merits, i.e., did Nelson County arbitrarily and capriciously deny the granting of this variance. So it'll be an interesting case because obviously without that permit or without that variance to the Nelson County ordinance, Dominion, cannot go through all of the various floodplains that they are proposing to go through, at least in Nelson County. I will say this about Judge Moon. Judge Moon asked the Nelson County attorney hundreds of questions, I think would be fair. He asked the Dominion attorney 3 or 4 questions, probably at most. It was very clear that he is not the kind of judge that is likely to set a precedent, which this would be, because no other court has held that there's not a preemption by the Natural Gas Act. So it would take a significant opinion on his part to go down that road. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, obviously, none of us are, but I would say that based upon the questions asked, his body language, etc., that I'm sure Nelson County is probably already considering appealing. And so we'll see what happens. Anybody else have any other questions? That's the end of my soggy paperwork, and those are the major cases that I decided that I would try and cover.
Does the district court have 12 judges and then the panel of 3?
No, ma'am. That's the Circuit Court of Appeals.
Okay.
The district court, you have a judge,
Okay.
and that judge will issue a written opinion in this case, and then that's appealable to the circuit court, where it will then be heard by a panel of 3 judges.
But I'm talking about the District of Columbia.
Oh, the District of Columbia. All federal district courts have a panel of 3 judges, and then if you don't like that ruling, you can request a rehearing en banc, E-N-B-A-N-C,
Okay,
en banc.
same as the fourth.
So it's the same as the 4th. They're all exactly the same. And I'll be honest with you, one of the questions that I asked SELC yesterday was, do you know the panel? Who are the 3 judges going to be in the District of Columbia Circuit Court? The answer is, we don't know yet. We just filed our first brief. The judges have not yet been selected. In all fairness and honesty, depending upon who those 3 judges are and who appointed them, you may very well get a very positive opinion, or you may get an opinion that you're not going to be happy with, and that's the reality of it. So it'll be absolutely critical. I mean, as an attorney, the first thing that I want to know is, who's the panel? Who am I arguing to? Who's going to read my brief? Because that way you can kind of focus it towards what their interest is, and you can try and get them interested in your side. Ma'am.
Who chooses those 3?
How are they selected?
Yes, how are these selected?
Typically, the chief judge of the circuit pulls together a panel, and that's how it's done. Yes, sir.
Since he was able to get a change of venue,
Yes.
is it possible that they could
Probably not any more than, you or I. No, I don't think so. I really don't. Circuit courts are pretty, they've got their way of doing things, and they don't get a lot of influence from the outside. What will be of influence is who appointed the circuit court judges that are on that panel. But how they get selected, I don't think that they'll get any preferential treatment just because they're in the District of Columbia Circuit. I really don't. Anybody else? Sir?
I'll say one comment about the floodplain issue in
Yes.
Nelson County. For those of you who are in Nelson County, make sure your supervisors hear from you and that you want them to continue to fight this. I've heard from at least one supervisor that there's concern that there may not be a lot of appetite to keep this up against a big behemoth like Dominion. And so we need to make sure that they realize that we want them to stay on this one and not let it go because it's worth winning.
Keep in mind, to second what you're saying there, Richard, Nelson County is not using the county attorney, okay? So they are spending money for what I fondly call an outhouse attorney, as opposed to an in-house attorney. So the woman counsel, I thought, did a very good job. She was very bright. She was very well prepared. She was quite articulate. She did not back down from this judge at all. which I think some people would have kind of folded their tent early and not been as aggressive as she was. But she made her point, it's in the record, and you have to do that because what gets appealed is the record that's in front of that judge. And so it's the record in front of the judge and the opinion written by the judge, and that's what gets appealed. So I would hardly agree with that. I will say to you, my experience, with no attorney's fees involved, to appeal to the Fourth Circuit is probably a $20,000 bite. So with attorney's fees, you're probably looking at $30,000 to $40,000 to make that appeal. So that's what the county's looking at, and that's what they're going to be considering. Is it worth spending that kind of money to appeal this case?
But as you said, this was not the issue, this was not the merits yet.
No, not at all.
Just on
No, exactly. This is a procedural motion, and they have a ways to go.
Yeah.
Unless the judge, for some unbelievable reason, issues a summary judgment for Dominion. But hopefully he won't do that. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Part of my question was on that. He mentioned that in court he won summary judgment. Is he allowed to do that, even though it wasn't requested?
He asked her
Right,
about a summary judgment. He didn't ask Dominion.
right.
But I think if he feels that based upon the facts that he's seen and the briefs that he's seen, the summary judgment is appropriate, it wouldn't surprise me totally if he issued a summary judgment for one party or the other. And in this case, if he does, it'll be for the other.
There was no discovery, there was no...
Yeah, I understand, right. And she made that point. So, I think that's why I think that that's not going to happen. I don't think you're going to see a summary judgment